Yeah, thank you, Rodney. Thank you. I think it was sometime in the summer, Rodney emailed me and said, can we meet for coffee and talk about this idea of the unique and the universal, and how maybe you might, and your students might play a role in this. And I happened to be at the time teaching a history of the essay course, and it was, fresh on my mind at the time that an essay in the literary sense of the personal essay needs to be both unique to personal experience, but also universal. So we have some access into that private, insular life that it resonates on some other larger levels. And I've always said that you need to cast out from the lonely island of self and to engage the larger world. So I was very much on board with this idea, and I put together a talk, but then I started rallying the boots on the ground, as it were, doing the good work. And I think it was really clear to them that the essay was a model of working in the unique and the universal. So I'm just going to introduce each of the graduate students here, a little bit of what they're working on. That's probably for me, so it could be awkward if I get hauled out of here. We're going to start first with, I'll introduce the students. They'll read for about 15 minutes each. And then afterwards, I'll pose maybe one, maybe two questions and turn it over to you guys, and you can ask them about their process of writing, about the essay as a form, about what it means to write in the unique and the universal, and we'll just sort of roll with the conversation that way. To my right, Ann Stebner-Steele is a Wyoming native who is currently living in Moscow, where she attends the U of I's MFA Creative Writing program in nonfiction. She spends her time writing, teaching, horseback riding, and camping with her husband, Rob, and their dog. And Rob is here, but I don't believe the dog is.
No,
okay.
She's at home.
Okay. She's currently working on a collection of essays about family, about place, about identity, and after completing her degree, she plans to return to Wyoming, her place, and the landscape that informs most of her writing and her stories. And that's Ann Stebner-Steele. Cara Stoddard is a second-year nonfiction candidate in the MFA program. She is from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where she grew up on a small inland lake. She completed her undergraduate work at the College of Worcester in Ohio and has since been a middle school teacher, ski instructor, backcountry guide, and after-school program coordinator. Is there anything you haven't done? Yes. She is currently working on a collection of essays that will document the process of her quest to try to answer one of her mother's many theories about the potential environmental effects of pesticide runoff in the lake in her backyard as cause for both her and her father's cancers. Jamaica Richard is a third-year nonfiction student in the MFA program. Her essays have aired on National Public Radio and have been anthologized in This I Believe, The Personal Philosophies of Remarkable Men and Women, and Labor Pains and Birth Stories. She's currently working on a book-length project about women, abortion, and family at the turn of the 20th century and now. And finally, Aaron Poor is a third-year nonfiction candidate in the Master of Fine Arts program in nonfiction. He received a degree in mathematics and embarked upon several short-lived careers before settling into writing. His thesis will be a collection of essays about work and his father, a Vietnam veteran. So please welcome our panel. And Anne, if you just want to start with your work.
All right. I'm reading from an essay called The Headwaters. It's a much longer essay in its form right now. It's 24 pages, but I have just over 7 for you tonight because I thought 24 might be a little long. So if there are gaps, that's probably why I tried to go with the pieces that were most coherent, but we'll see how it goes. So, The Headwaters. Here's a story. In 1978, before my parents were parents, they stood with their longtime friend Dick Martin on the banks of the North Fork of Bull Lake Creek, deep in the Wind River Mountains on Wyoming's Wind River Indian Reservation. They watched the white water pound through the outlet of Milky Lake. 2 days and 10 miles before, a friend had dropped them at the end of a 2-track dirt road, and they had set out with compasses, maps, and fly rods to bushwhack their way deep into the mountains, beyond trail markers and campgrounds. They had humped it on rough horse trails that faded into the broken braids of elk trails, which brought them to Milky's Inlet, where they made camp for the night. Next, they planned to forge a path over and down ridges into the next major drainage, the cleft of South Fork, headed for Alpine Lake. Finally, out to St. Lawrence Basin, where Martin's truck waited some 25 miles away, the keys tucked into the nook in the back bumper. But first, they had to ford the outlet at Milky. So, on this third day, they had broken camp and struck out for the crossing. On the map, this looked simple. It wasn't. Milky is high and glacial, nestled in granite smooth as gemstone, with shores of gray rock that plunge beneath the surface of the opaque turquoise water. The rock is young, geologically speaking, and has only recently begun to break down. Towering, meandering hulks of stone and thick brush, deadfall, and stands of dark timber force trails out and around the shores of the lake, making a direct passage between any 2 points almost impossible. Though the 3 hikers were familiar with the terrain, they'd had to bushwhack for 5 hours to cover the single mile to the outlet. They had finally emerged from the timber, only to be confronted by the roar of the water as it gathered force above a granite chute 15 yards across, before plummeting down a series of waterfalls taller than they were. My mother shifted her weight, running her fingers along the straps of her green Kelty backpack my father had given to her the previous year before they were married. Her cross-eyed, inbred toy poodle Muffet whined and looked up at her. The small dog's curly gray coat was matted with pitch and pine needles she'd picked up as she'd bowled her way through the dark timber. My mother's arms ached from repeatedly picking the poodle up to carry her over snarls of deadfall. My father ran a hand over his wild brown curls, then cocked his thumbs against his lean hips. "What do you think?" he yelled. "We can't cross here," my mother said. "Not a chance. It'll be closer to the lake." Martin pointed upstream. Deafened by the pummeling water, they tiptoed back up the outlet towards the lake along the edges of the torrent with Muffet on their heels. The water flattened and began to smooth about 200 yards above the chute. There, at the widest point, the currents were already starting to pick up momentum, though they still appeared to belong to the lake. The crossing was broken into 3 parts by long islands of granite emerging from the water. Laden with their packs, the trio waded from the shore to the first island, then the next, the water thigh-deep, frigid and hazy with the turquoise sheen and sediment of the lake. With Muffet under one arm, my mother felt for the bottom, seeking the surest footing, the soles of her boots sliding over the uneven, unseen, slick rocks. The dog's small gray feet paddled frantically above the water as the current swirled and pulsed around them. So they came to the third crossing, and 30 feet of water swept between them and the far shore. They could not see any trace of the bottom, just gray granite disappearing into the green reflection of the sky. Martin, who was a head taller than my father at 6'4", decided to jump in and see how deep it was. He dropped his pack and sprang into the water. It clapped closed over his head, and he bobbed sputtering to the surface with his blonde hair in his eyes. His feet had never touched stone or silt as he sank. Swimming wasn't an option with their heavy packs, so they spent the next few hours fashioning a makeshift raft by lashing together a handful of deadfall pines. It would not support their weight, but would carry one backpack at a time. They picked a point of departure upstream from where they wanted to land on the far bank, for the current was too strong to swim straight across. All 3 of them stripped to their underwear, bundling their thick pants and sweaty t-shirts into their packs. They stepped to the bank and paused, craning forward from their toes to look down into the opaque water. Martin and my father began ferrying the packs while my mother prepared to carry Muffet across. The dog was too small to withstand the current, even if she had been able to swim, instead of bobbing up and down like a cork. My mother lowered herself into the currents, sitting on the edge of the rock first, then sliding into the outlet with the bedraggled toy poodle under one arm, treading water to keep her head above the surface. Her breath was shocked away the moment the water enveloped her. She heard the current churning against rocks, splashing against her body, pushing, pulling, insistent on movement, reckless and wild. Her pulse beat hard between her ears, pounded in time with the water. She gasped and sputtered, but kept moving, pulling and kicking for the far shore. She grasped the dog's scruff with one hand and stroked with her free hand. The waters threatened to steal Muffet from her grip, to swallow the small dog whole. Above them, dark pines lined crags of stone that rose like waves along the swell of ridges, a sea of wilderness and wildness into which they had leapt. There was no turning back. I have often heard my parents and Martin tell this story, grew up hearing it and others of their adventures in the wild country of Wyoming. And I was raised largely in that country, familiar with the twists cut fresh by riverbanks each spring, the haunts of my parents' youth becoming my own. My older brother Danny and I have learned what it is worth, the effort to go into the winds. We began following our parents as soon as we were old enough to carry our own gear, strong enough to buck the miles. The country is rugged. The winds are nearly 100 miles long and boast over 900,000 acres of designated wilderness in the Bridger, Paposia, and Fitzpatrick wilderness areas, as well as the Wind River roadless area on the reservation. Though traditionally enemies, the northern Arapaho and eastern Shoshone tribes have worked together to protect their land, and the Wind River roadless area was formed in 1983 at the urging of tribal leaders. It is both the first and oldest roadless area in the United States, predating the Wilderness Act of 1964 by 26 years. The Continental Divide abuts the area's western boundary, making it even more remote. Few hikers and backpackers move on the reservation lands in the winds because they are rugged with unmaintained trails and because permits that license non-native access are required for fishing, hiking, and camping. The fee for these courtesy permits has increased in conjunction with rising interest in the area, from $25 for an adult Wyoming resident in 1975 to $80 plus a $5 conservation stamp in 2011. Thus, the country remains remote and wild, even though it has gained popularity in the last quarter century with climbers and backcountry enthusiasts. It was this wildness, this unknown, that drew my parents into the winds, and it is also at the heart of many of the stories I've grown up with. My father is fond of saying that when others asked him about how to go into those mountains, he would point to them in the distance and say, "There they are, go." I always think of this as sort of an invocation and a challenge, a charge to walk into big country not knowing what you will find there, which is what my parents did all those years ago. When my parents met, my father was an attorney with the Fort Washakie Office of Legal Aid of Wyoming, a federally funded nonprofit law firm that provided legal assistance to low-income residents. He lived in a two-room cabin on the Little Wind River and came to know the land and the people of the Wind River Indian Reservation. Raised by his own father to push ever deeper into the Wyoming high desert near Hanna and north of Rawlins in the south-central part of the state, where our family has a long tradition of camping and hunting, my father found himself drawn to the mountains. In the 1970s, prejudice against the Native American population and resistance to paying the tribes for the courtesy permits kept many locals from the area, and news of the bountiful fishing and alpine vistas had yet to trickle out of the state. Thus, the country was relatively untouched. My father was hooked. It was country ripe for adventure, and he bought United States Geographical Survey maps to study in his cabin, spent every free moment with his friends fishing in the winds, and asked Shoshone and Arapaho elders about the streams and lakes deeper in the mountains, the places where the horse outfitters didn't ride, the places beyond the end of the faint trails, the places where few men had walked. My mother and Martin gladly joined him in this drive for rougher, wilder, more distant wilderness, and they created their own stories of exploring the spurs of the mountains where the land is remote. My father was lean and brown, his hair not yet gone to silver. My mother was slim in double-kneed canvas pants, her smile slightly crooked, the crinkle around her eyes not yet fully etched. Martin was tall and burly, his legs strong, his knees not yet stiff. When I hear the stories about my parents' youth in the mountains, about how wild they were in their quest for new country, I envy the abandon with which they gave themselves to the land. Sometimes, my parents tell me these tales around the dinner table, where I linger over my empty plate long after we've finished eating, still hungry for their words. Sometimes, we stand around campfires in the wind rivers themselves, watching the smoke curl up as the stories unfold once more. I know these stories. I have seen the outlet, new waters rushing through the granite chute, pushing against the banks. Still, I ask to hear the stories again and again. My mother came to the far shore first. She clawed her way up the steep, rocky bank and lay panting on the cold granite. Then she set to work finding a patch of dirt to build a fire while the men made their last trip. My father was beginning to suffer from signs of hypothermia, shaking violently, his lips thin and blue, the water leaching the feeling from his toes and fingers. Martin, a larger man, was better able to sustain the cold, but they were all wet and bone cold as well as exhilarated, and they needed warmth. They needed the warmth of a fire. As the flames flashed into life, the men straggled to the shore with the last pack, and the trio gathered on the rock, shivering and laughing in the passing warmth of the fire in the mountain afternoon. If the raft had tipped, they would have lost the packs and all their gear. If they had tired in midstream, the currents could have crushed them against rocks. But their bodies and grit had carried them unscathed across the outlet to the far bank, and now there were miles to make. So they shouldered their packs once more and rushed headlong through the mountains, strong and untethered. That night, they would crash down onto Alpine Lake through quaky aspen stands, kicking loose stones down before them. And when they came to a wide, sandy beach along the lake shore, they would drop their packs and race to rig their fishing rods, seeing who could be the first to have a line in the water, leaving the tents and gear to be set up by flashlight. My husband Rob and I spent our week-long honeymoon backpacking in the Wind Rivers. I was 24, 4 years younger than my mother had been when she jumped into the outlet. It was the second trip I'd made with my new pack, an internal frame maroon Gregory that Rob and my parents had given me for my birthday. The green Keltie was left hanging in my parents' shed, where it still rests. Our route was one I knew well, but I'd always walked it with my parents, Martin or Danny. And though Rob is handy with a map and compass, and had walked into Milky Lakes with my family a few times and knew his way around the mountains, this was his first trip into South Fork. I was the only one of the two of us to have traveled this ground before. Everything felt fresh as I led the way, as Rob and I oriented the map against landmarks because my parents weren't there to confirm that this was indeed the way. But I was guided through this familiar country just the same, knowing exactly where to flick my fly, imagining my father coaching me like he had 2 summers before when I hauled that big cutthroat gleaming like a knife from the water, seeing the reflection of my mother crouching on the bank of the big hole below camp, ladling water over her hair or running a fly line through her fingers. In the 2 years that Rob and I have lived in Idaho, we have made a handful of backpacking trips into the mountains nearby, but I long for the Wind Rivers and the streams that I know. We often plan our return to Wyoming, itself a sort of leap of faith, one that rests on the choice of staying where we know the water, choosing the wisdom imparted to us even as that knowledge strips away some of the wildness we might otherwise seek on distant shores. I do not know how far this leap will take me, if I will stay close to the traditional camps of my parents, of my youth, upon my return, or if I will use them as headwaters for my own discovery. I do not even know for sure if there yet remains deeper unknown country anymore as more people come to the mountains every year. On our honeymoon, Rob and I planned to make some excursions during the day to explore the facing ridge that broke in shelves away from Windy Ridge, but instead we stayed close to camp, stretched out in the grass with novels, and fished the known bends of the creek until we thought we recognized the fish we caught and threw back. We watched the running water that moved like a living thing. South Fork roared down from white peaks, tumultuous in granite where the white water ran wildly but followed the channels cut by the currents that came before. In the meadow, trees had split the hard rock and the water slowed, lingered in sunlight and shadows of grasses, gathered sediment from that place before it split and leapt forward. And as the water slipped by in the sun, I contemplated the peaks in the distance, imagining walking up to touch the granite to find the snow-cold headwaters.
I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay that may or may not be a little bit out of date. I was working on it last year in the spring semester, and so I think it's sort of exigent moment has maybe passed, but it's sort of a political essay and also kind of dealing with, and I'm not a political person, so, and it's sort of dealing with bringing in different artifacts or things that I'm reading at the time. So this is called On Indignation. My mother last February sent me a single frame cartoon cut out from the Grand Rapids Press. The sketch is of a mother holding the hand of her young daughter who is wearing a bucket upside down on her head. The caption reads, "She has her father's politics." The point of the joke is that mothers always blame their children's shortcomings on their fathers, but this cartoon's statement about my political preference is pretty apt. Which is to say that I have my head in the sand, which is to say that my mother thinks I'm apolitical, which is to say she's probably right. But recently, I've been dabbling in Gerald R. Ford's autobiography, A Time to Heal. I feel neglecting to look at the life of my hometown hero at this particular crossroads during this hot-headed political climate would be remiss. It's a memoir of amnesty, of doling out forgiveness. He is frank and methodical in detailing his life. He uses a calm and collected rhetoric, the vernacular of a politician who has nothing to hide. He pardoned Nixon, forgave the Vietnam draft dodgers who ran away to Canada, even excused pregnant women who chose to abort their babies they had no intention of bringing into this world. And he's supposed to be a Republican. Tell that to Sarah Palin and the creative forces who not so long ago conceived of the Take Back the 20 website. This is what we've stooped to, a U.S. map with the icon of a gun scope centered on the locations of the 20 Democrats who voted for Obama's health care bill in formerly Republican-leaning districts, a self-fulfilling prophecy. 2 years ago, I lived in a home sheltering 3 generations. My mother, the epicenter of all of us, ruled the decisions in that house. I woke to her TV in the kitchen, blaring the Today Show. Then, after Mom left for work, Grandpa dozed to CNBC's stock market ticker, keeping me updated. Coca-Cola's up 3 1/4, whatever that means. At 4, on days my mother and I skipped work or came home early, we drank Pinot Grigio and watched the Ellen DeGeneres Show, a show my mother loves, says Ellen should win Woman of the Year even if she's gay. Then Jeopardy for Grandma and for Dad, and Wheel of Fortune while my mom made dinner. And after too many nights of the O'Reilly factor, my mother said enough is enough, banished Grandpa and Grandma to the TV in the attic to watch that trash so she could watch HGTV's Property Virgins. Ford never wanted to be president. He hated a spectacle, believed Nixon was telling him the truth until the tapes were transcribed and Nixon was caught, smoking gun in hand. Humility and integrity synonymous with Ford's presidency, and inevitably, through no fault of his own, the picking up the pieces of a country deceived. Ford and I, our childhoods are essentially the same, carbon copies of all the best opportunities, parents who knew how to balance discipline and compassion. The Grand Rapids that Ford grew up in was a straight-laced city built on the promise of the Grand River and the automobile. The 60 years that transpired between his childhood and mine did little in the ways of turning this Midwestern city into a progressive, diverse, all-inclusive melting pot of open-minded individuals. Grand Rapids votes Republican. But as is true with all good children of strict parenting, there is inevitably rebellion, that irrevocable rift between parent and child when both learn for the first time that they are autonomous beings. Ford's mutiny was in middle school, playing poker in his father's shed, betting pennies. And when his stepfather caught them red-handed, they were severely reprimanded. Mine was in 3rd grade, a silent uprising against my mother's limitless authority. I learned her values quickly, the consequences of withholding the truth. That impactful night when my mother shook me awake long after my bedtime, emptied my backpack onto the kitchen counter, asked why I hadn't been spending my milk money. I saw splayed before me on that pink formica the baggie of all those nickels and dimes, the coins spread to cover the largest surface area possible, weighted down by the gravity of being found out. I said that the milk at school was warm and the lunch lady would make me drink it all because it makes the trash bags heavy, and all that unwanted milk would cause the bags to tear, would drip and spill across the gymnasium's floor when she hauled them out to the dumpster. And that accumulation of daily lies, that pit of dread, accepting the week's envelope of change, 5 days of milk money I'd never spend, that would turn into a month's worth and then into 2 months' worth, and maybe at age 8, I started to doubt that child's certainty that parents are omniscient. In college, I would stand behind that full-length mirror on the back of my dorm room door and look at the truth of my being for the first time. Lurking behind my skin, behind all the tangible flesh and cells, the part of me that moves without muscles, without neurons firing, flinched in recognition at the truth of her lips on my neck and the sheet stuffed between the bed and the wall. And maybe this had always been lying dormant, but all these years of overlooking it made me feel fickle, out of touch with what was real inside, made me feel like a stranger to myself, ashamed, not in the bodily act of her flesh on my flesh, but in the lie. Maybe I learned more about my ability to disappoint that night, standing barefoot on the kitchen linoleum, than the gravity of keeping secrets. How that lie that began as a silence felt so small, so insignificant at first, and how, after that first untruth, how all the other untruths came easier, like an inevitable, unstoppable train. Deceit ratcheted taut. I learned to pat my head and rub my belly simultaneously, to never let my left hand know what my right was doing, to hide even the most basic truths of my identity from myself. Perhaps this kind of realization was always there, in my subconscious, a truth I have always known, like a myclonic jerk on the raft that is my childhood bed, barely asleep and falling over the edge. Jared Lee Lochner once asked Representative Giffords, "How do you know words mean anything?" Politicians should spend some time studying Saussure. The signifier refers directly to the signified. Maybe then they might know better than to fight violence with violence. Maybe then they would know the whole slew of baggage they are calling upon when they throw around words like blood libel. Ford donated blood to pay his way through college, but today this kind of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is scoffed at. The ideal of the American dream turned into some sick joke. I tried for 2 years to get a career track job after college, one with benefits, so my mother would quit harping on me to figure my shit out. Emerson said something about self-reliance once. We live in the age of the first-person singular. I played duck hunt as a child, let the computer simulator position me behind the scope, zoom in on my target, all the challenge and skill reduced to the mind-numbing centering of the crosshair on a bird. But I'm not from Alaska and I don't own a gun. Some things are funny until they manifest into reality. Perhaps Ford's character and merit as a political leader can best be described as he explains his own ambidexterity. For as long as I can remember, I have been left-handed when I've been sitting down and right-handed when I'm standing up. I throw a football with my right hand and write with my left. And maybe this kind of ambiguity is noble, is endearing, is having two dichotomies existent in the self simultaneously. He was an Eagle Scout, you know, always prepared, unconditionally trustworthy, loyal, helpful, courteous, etc., etc. Lived a morally straight life and then transcribed that life into a widely popular book, printed and bound and read cover to cover in one sitting by my grandfather. My memories, unlike Ford's, will not be bookended by Bible verses. I might as well have been born in California with Richard Nixon, with how far I've strayed from the values calcified behind plexiglass cases in the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, 3 blocks from where my mother still lives, alone now in that house that once held 5 adults and 2 dogs. They call the 2000s the noughts, which means zero, but also means lost, ruined, worthless, morally corrupt, like we are living in some sort of black hole, an empty set, a vast wasteland barren of meaning. And maybe caring about all this was for naught, because how do I know words mean anything? Because so many words have been broadcast on the Today Show, on CSNBC, on CNN and Fox, about the recession and healthcare reform and gay rights, and now Occupy Wall Street, and people still hate, and people still die. I watched Ford's funeral on the cable TV at work, heard the low-flying Air Force jets usher his body into Grand Rapids, sat bumper to bumper in the traffic jam that ensued, but I was struck by something like indifference. One critic of the leftist political rhetoric says liberals are pointing the finger at the Tea Partiers, saying that the Tucson shooting was the product of all the loaded language flying around these days, that it wasn't just one man who held the gun. But Lochner was mentally ill, was apolitical. The critic argues that those who knew him have committed the greatest crime, that perhaps Lochner should never have had the opportunity to buy a gun. But hindsight is not the same thing as a social critique that necessitates change, mandates toning down our language. Maybe I like the sentiment of the Boston Tea Party, civilians enacting their last fleeting strands of autonomy and the adrenaline rush of dumping all that tea into the harbor, teaking the ocean brown. But when the critic likens the leftist call for cooling the political fury to don't ask, don't tell, perhaps because both instances require a silence, beg us to bite our tongues, I want to stand on a chair and shout something vengeful. What if we ask ourselves where anger comes from, where hate comes from? Will we look in the mirror and see Lochner's bald head, lopsided grin? And who ever decided privacy was a good thing? If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Don't look Lochner in the eye now and tell me he scares you. Lochner tried to buy extra bullets at Walmart the morning of January 8th. The sales associate was afraid of him, his otherness, his bald head, his shabby clothes. So much so she hid out in the back room for several minutes before returning with the lie, "We're out of stock." And I wonder how many lives that lie saved. And when I look in the mirror now, all I see is deceit. I am standing in that parking lot on the asphalt in Arizona in January. And I want to say being apolitical has made me numb to all of this, but it hasn't. There is a 76-year-old retired construction worker who shares the same last name as me, but to whom I am not related, who died in that Safeway parking lot because of misplaced anger. And Christina Taylor Greene, 9 years old, do we dare speak the names of the dead, born on the day of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, born into a world of burning buildings, burning tempers, burning words. I came out to my mother during a blizzard on a Wednesday, in a month that has more hours of darkness than daylight. I sent those words, "Mom, I'm gay," in an email past my bedtime, well aware of the 3-hour time change between where I live now and the Pacific time zone, and Michigan Eastern Standard Time. That she wouldn't get the news till morning. She says in an email reply the next day that she has lots of friends who are gay, meaning she has a gay hairdresser, and that as a mother, she just wants me to be happy, that she knows it's hard for people who are gay. Says the hardest thing for her is the deceit. For 4 years, I knew and never said anything, slept under the heavy down comforters of other women's beds, and the weight of that lie felt infinite against my naked body. In 2001, more than 20 years after publishing his autobiography, Ford broke with the conservative tradition, telling a Detroit journalist that gay and lesbian couples ought to be treated equally, period. Even now, 5 years after his death, he is still the highest-ranking Republican to ever publicly embrace full equality for gays and lesbians. And I feel a wash of relief in having his approval, like maybe his forgiveness is also Grand Rapids' forgiveness, is also merit for me to forgive myself, and maybe people are allowed to change their minds.
Tonight is called Making Bread. I learned to make bread out of poverty. My husband, our 2 children, and I living on little more than nothing on the edge of the California Bay Area. My home, a place I know and the place my husband lands a job. The one job, though barely enough. So we rent a cottage in the country, the rickety maid's quarters to an estate surrounded by fruit. We dig our garden and hang a swing from an old black walnut. We take our children blackberry picking and we fish along the creek like we are bears. And after my husband receives his monthly paycheck, I sit at the kitchen table beneath a ceiling deformed by water damage doing bills. I make a grocery list and I learn to make something of a $3 sack of flour. I learn to bake a wealth of bread. Leveling flour in a cup, resurrecting desiccated yeast, heating honeyed milk and pouring, slow and steady, the wets into the dries. It is the making I want to know. Baking seems nostalgic. I hear the word and my mind goes to warm hearths and the promise of full bellies. I imagine folk art woodcuts, depictions of moments of plenty chiseled from their context. But to make is something different. I need the road to that steaming, fragrant endpoint and the work required along the way. I want to feel the muscle ache that comes with the effort of kneading and have the time it will take to wait for the rise. I want to create something whereby in the process, each silky filament, the whole of the finished product contained within the crust, has been touched by the skin of my palms. My bread book is thick like a volume of spells. I take it down, splay it against the table, and turn each page like a witch deliberating which part of the lizard should next meet the cauldron. I sift through my options, the myriad variations of 3 main ingredients, yeast, wheat, and water. A warm, fast rise and the dough rolled flat for pita, ice-cold water, and a rise stretched for hours to make a slender stick of French batard. The relative decadence of adding milk, egg, potato, or a generous dollop of butter gives rise to a high and springy loaf. So many recipes, and through each runs a common thread. Despite the time and attention required for each, all are made to disappear. The stack of steaming pitas, a golden crusted baguette, an earthy loaf of milk bread brushed with melted butter. By the next day, what remains of the cook's efforts are crumbs. Late morning, I sprawl myself on the living room floor with a book opened flat beneath my palm, letting my toddler son use the length of me as a human highway for his matchbox cars. I flip the pages covertly and read the text with sidelong glances, hoping to pass for still playing in his game. The days can be so long, and sometimes I don't know anymore what to do with this little boy. Caught out with the novel, I divert his attention. Who wants to help Mama make bread? My son barrels up to the kitchen table, dragging a wooden chair he'd positioned directly in front of the bread bowl. He grasps the measuring cup and plunges his arm into the flour sack, trying as if by braille to emerge with a level measure. He'll do this once, dumping the cup's contents into the bowl and immediately raking his fingers through the fine ground meal as if it were something like sand, and together we sift and measure, sample and stir. I spoon yeast from a darkened jar and sprinkle the granules into a mug of warm water. I used to have a delicate teacup expressly for this purpose. One of my bread books suggests wetting yeast in a warmed china cup, and I just happened to have one that had belonged to my great-grandmother. But the cup was one of an expansive dinnerware set, 20 plates, salad plates, cups and saucers, a platter, and a gravy boat. Packed into a cardboard tote like a three-dimensional puzzle, my grandmother had given me the set of her mother-in-law's china when I moved into my first apartment. Surely I must have imagined my grandfather as a boy sitting down to his mother's table, but I kept the dishes boxed and lugged the tote from one rented apartment to another, too burdened by the collection to appreciate its history, or to imagine that I might one day feel sentimentally toward what at the time seemed little more than surfaces off which to eat. I went through the process of paring down my possessions once. I wanted to eschew materialism, I said, and go forward unburdened by things. To an extent, this was true, but more than noble asceticism, I just didn't like my life, the isolated life in the country, the poverty and the domesticity, things that had begun to make me restless, and of which I sometimes felt ashamed. So I discarded nearly everything inanimate and mine. I remember the charity gift shop, my cold sweat and my stomach cramping, needing the attendant to take the box away. I had nowhere to keep it, yet afraid that was what he would do. In the end, he carried the box of dishes into the shop, baffled by my urgency to shed hand-painted heirloom china. Now I grow nostalgic for those lost pieces of my ancestry. Now I wet my baker's yeast in a brown crockery mug stamped Made in Korea, but I can watch each speck of yeast meet the water and sink, dissolve and come to life. Bubbles begin to form at the surface, and I know what this will mean for the bread. But once upon a time, the yeast's airy industries were a mistake. The ancient Egyptians mixed flour and water, forgetting the brew in the open air. Wild yeast, unseen, alit and went to work. And what did those early bakers think? How did they explain the sponginess of a dough that had up until then been dense? It wasn't until the mid-1800s that yeast was identified as an organism, and so came to exist in our minds. Today, leavened bread is a staple, something always there. At one point, it was a mystery and something to learn. I pour the cup of breathing yeast into the bowl of flour. Then I dip my fingertips into the soup and trace the bowl's interior into a whirlpool that catches the grain. With hands in the bowl, I squeeze and stir and watch the mixture meld. My son revels in the mud pie mess of the dough for just a fraction of the 20 minutes it will take to knead a pillow loaf. He plays at the work until his mind takes him back to a pileup of cars left out on the living room rug. I clean off his hands, and on the momentum built from our time spent together, he toddles off, content to play on his own, leaving me with the kneading and my thoughts. The dough is wet and sticks to my skin and the wooden tabletop. To suddenly move my hands in one direction or another is to fling a mixture that will dry into cement, cemented flecks on the foam, on the kitchen curtains, on the cuff of my sleeve. It is a true mess, and I cannot help but feel discouraged that for a few moments that my project is going to fail. My palms press into the mass, and my mind brims with thoughts of the news I tune in too close for, news of a world that for me is far too big. My mind replays the pelting sound bites that are nearer to a horror flick than journalism. War, execution, fear, sensation, a hurricane of events no one person can control. At any moment of a day or night, I might think of my place in that storm, the place of my children and my husband, the wind and debris whipping us on our way into an ominous unknown. With each year of my life, stories manage to reach me that at the time I am sure cannot be topped. Do you remember the young American man's execution in Iraq? For some reason, I still think of him, an independent contractor working overseas, kidnapped by young Iraqi men who, after holding him for a time, kill him with a blind over his head and a machete in his neck. Someone videotaped and then rebroadcast the scene. And I think of the young man's mother and father beaten down by each confrontation with their nightmare in the media, their helplessness and grief. I think of earthquakes, entire cities crumbling, of mothers and fathers and children searching through the bricks and mortar for signs of one another. I think of flames. I don't know what I can do about this news, or what I, as one person, can do about a world that holds such suffering. I want to drop what I'm doing and gather my children, keep their bodies and breath warm in my arms, feel the flutter of their heartbeats when they lean back against me, my belly, that safe house from whence they came. I want to know that there were such intensities of fear and apprehension 10,000 years ago. I'd like to think that the women who first set out those wheaten cakes in the sun, too, were worried about their family's future and their own place in the present. I want to know that despite fear, they continued to bake bread and to nourish. I have read about prisoners, political prisoners, prisoners of war with their bread and water, the way they sit in their dark cells, working it like clay, molding it between fingers into birds, into art. After a time, the dough begins to firm and hold together, and I can begin to maneuver it. The muscles in my hands tense against this first effort as I press the dough with my left hand and fold it with my right. Press and fold and turn just slightly, trying to establish a rhythm. The muscles in my forearms tense and the veins rise beneath my skin as my hands push, stretch, and fold the heavy mass. I count each turn of the dough and echo the numbers in my mind, bringing this strange mantra into synchronicity with my breath. I press and count and breathe, the mental images floating and receding, allowing my mind a calmer pool. Beneath my fingers, the dough changes. With each pressure my palm exerts, the proteins in the flour untangle and realign, forming the gluten. The gluten develops in response to pressure and contortion, constructs a matrix that will hold the yeast's gas and determine the bread's texture, the texture like a sponge. Press and fold and turn just slightly. Press and fold and turn. In the task, there is monotony. In monotony resides a rhythm. In the rhythm comes a calm. I work the dough in solitude, my mind filling, my mind letting go. Beads of sweat gather along my hairline, trickle the nape of my neck and the small of my back. I begin to hear my surroundings, a car engine down the road, the voices of women walking on the street, the peel and slap of the dough against the surface of the table, the sound of my work. And I realize that what 20 minutes ago was sticky and unpleasant to the touch is now beautifully silky and dry, that the dough, once heavy and cumbersome, has somehow lightened so as to be springy in my grasp. Each stray clump of dough has loosened its hold on my hands, on the table, and worked itself in with the rest, and I grow certain this bread will be perfect. I round the dough into a ball and set it back into the bowl. To keep kneading will ruin this, overdeveloping the gluten to render a soggy mess of something that moments ago was just right. It is time for a new activity. In a few hours, the dough will need my attention again, and I'll return, pressing it down, forming it into the shape of a loaf, and then trusting the fire to finish well my work. So I let it go, covering the opaque sphere with a dampened square of cloth, and leave the room to let it rise.
This essay is called The Sunroom, a Residential Lament. When my wife and I moved from Oregon to Washington State in 2006, we purchased a 1961 ranch-style house. It's got 3 bedrooms and a master bath and a full basement with a toilet next to the clothes dryer. There's a large backyard with a swing set, a raspberry patch, and a garden shed. Over its history, the house has seen a number of owners, giving it a checkered reputation in a neighborhood where several residents have lived for over 40 years. Though the prior owners took good care of the place, their tastes have not always aligned with ours. We've replaced a hedge with a hospitable cedar fence and planted a few trees to bring a little privacy from windows that loom over our backyard, add some shade and stateliness to the street, and will hopefully yield apples and pears one day. Much of the work inside has been that of pure aesthetic maintenance, primarily the removal of old wallpaper and the application of various hues of colorful paint. I'm now entering my 10th year of home ownership, and I'm increasingly realizing how the comfort a home offers is offset by the time and energy required for upkeep. Painting and fence building take away from time at my desk or out with my kids. It seems one must strike a balance between the self-satisfaction of the former and the unadulterated pleasure of the latter, and my preference lies in unadulterated pleasure. Yet in the interest of not living in disorder and satisfying my wife, I attend to household projects at a rate of 1 or 2 a year, something we can both live with. It's through such regular scheduling that my grandparents have managed to keep their own 40-some-year-old ranch home in a midtown division of Riverside, California, fresh and pleasant. They're in their 80s now, and it's hard to imagine them leaving anytime soon. They're holding fast to their simple and elegant home, and I say elegant because I like the way the conjoined living room and dining room are craftily married to the backyard by a wall of windows and a pair of glass doors, has distinguished them as far as I can tell from their old friends and neighbors. Most of the former have migrated to newer suburbs in the foothills on the eastern edge of the city, suburbs with spotless vacant playgrounds, condominiums, and golf courses with higher green fees, or to well-to-do towns along the base of the San Gabriel Mountains to the north, out of an aging and hardening cityscape. I think it is in part their upkeep which allows them to remain and allows their home to remain a welcoming oasis. When I was small, a detached garage sat at the end of my grandparents' driveway. My grandmother remembers it with a visceral ugh and mentions cockroaches. I don't think I went in there too much. In my vague memories, it remains ordinary, dark and dusty with folding tables piled with boxes of tools and broken fans. I remember a doorway in which hung a beaded curtain, how I liked to move through it, listening to the clatter and feeling the strange tactile offering, a sensation like the one I got when I parted racks of garments while waiting for my mother at the clothing store. Perhaps I hid there and imagined I was a lion hiding in tall grass. I remember the building for what it became when I was in my teens, the Sunroom. My grandparents cordoned off the backyard with an 8-foot fence and emptied the garage and put big screen windows along the west and south sides and cabinets on the north. They put in white wicker furniture with blue floral print cushions and matching wallpaper, and a brand new ping pong table with new paddles and balls. When I visit now, my grandfather says to my grandmother, "Hey, Squeak, think Aaron wants to play ping pong?" Giving me the impression that my desire to play was far greater than the rest of the family. It stings a little bit to hear that, For that kid is still a part of me, that unquenchable desire to master the game and to win and be constantly at play. I never could beat my elders, but always believed I was one shot away. The sunroom to me was a lovely place, a room outside, some kind of wonderful fort, open to the yard, the air, the sounds of the city, the small prop planes buzzing low overhead as they descended into the nearby municipal airport. In the last 20-odd years, however, the sunroom has not maintained its luster. A leather bag of unswung golf clubs collects dust in the corner, the ping pong table sags in the middle, the paddles have broken or their surfaces are worn, the balls that haven't gone missing are yellow. There's a big TV and a wooden cabinet that's never turned on. I guess the sunroom is not high on the list of remodels now that my grandparents' offspring are older and live farther away. In the last decade, I've been lucky to visit every other year, and when I do, I rarely get there. I mostly sit at the picnic table on the back lawn catching up and watching the new generation play. I wonder if my grandparents recognize this, that there is less and less the need to go out there, that their retirement income is better spent on the house which they inhabit the most. When my wife and I talk of building a deck on the back of our house so we can spend a little more time outdoors, always rein us in by considering, in light of the overall cost, the amount of time we'll actually get to use the thing. We're not sure where we'll be in a few years, and over that time, the deck will not earn its cost. I wonder if my grandparents are also weighing the cost of things against time. I suppose most of us do, in the hope of leading lives of measured comfort. Yet I can dream, and in my dream I am a boy. I am in the sunroom at the end of the ping pong table facing the screen door. Through it come my family, taking turns opposite me, appeasing me by joining a game. My grandparents, my uncle, my father. We played doubles, hit aces, marveled at long rallies, our bodies leaning in rhythmically and the ball ticking time like the pendulum of a clock. When my cousin 2 years younger shows up, the game breaks down in some goof. In my dream, the paint, the wallpaper, the carpet and wicker is brilliant, unmarred. I hear idle conversation and laughter and nicknames called lengthily from the kitchen window, and everyone will live forever. My father gave home ownership a couple runs, the first time with my mother and me when I was a baby. He bought a house on an acre lot in rural Western Oregon, the house I grew up in. After my parents separated, he built a place in the desert outside of Riverside. It was family size with 3 bedrooms and a master bath with his and hers sinks. I hoped he was making room for a second wife, more kids maybe. He didn't last there 2 years before returning to Oregon. That was also when he stopped working, in his mid-30s. He'd lost both of his feet in Vietnam and received a full pension from the Veterans Administration. He could get by without working. He began to travel. Late in his life, I mentioned the desert house to him, trying to infer some motive on his part of actually settling. He said, having already relegated himself to the past tense, I never knew what I was going to do next. What can be said for sure is from there on, every place he lived in became smaller as he lessened his impression on the earth. 4 years in a 2-bedroom rental home in Springfield, Oregon, 5 more in another in Riverside near the School for the Deaf. The landlord eventually put that one up for rent. I should have bought that place, he said. Instead, he settled across town in an apartment, also 2 bedrooms, near an amusement park. He lived there more than 10 years, the longest he'd lived anywhere, he told me. But in 2005, high rent and obnoxious neighbors drove him out. He ended up at a place in my grandparents' neighborhood, his old neighborhood. He described it to me as a place for people like him, those with disabilities and those living on fixed incomes. It was smaller than where he was coming from, but still held 2 bedrooms. I saw the place the next Christmas. I stayed with my grandparents because I thought they would have more room for my family of 3. But my dad took us over shortly after we arrived. He lived in a meaner tract than my grandparents, one of small square homes on square lots and even streets. A line of flags marked the gate to his complex. It was separated from the street by a short drive, and fronted by an office building and a shimmering blue pool. A maintenance worker in shorts and a t-shirt drove by in a golf cart and waved, and a geriatric moved slowly down the sidewalk in an electric chair. "Dad," I said, "this is an old folks' home. You're too young for this." "No, I'm not," he said. "I'm a senior citizen. You're not even 60 yet." There was a little patio in front of his apartment under an awning of chocolate-colored rafters. It would have been a nice place for some tomatoes or a little lime tree, but it was barren save a plastic lawn chair and a small plastic table with a tuna tin for an ashtray and an antifreeze jug. There was a heavy screen door with a deadbolt. The only furniture in his living room was a used stuffed rocker. He put a remnant of astroturf in front of it so the hard heels of his Oxfords didn't wear out the carpet. At the end of the living room, his brown Formica table sat beneath the kitchen bar, its original chairs having been replaced with more plastic lawn chairs. Across from the rocker was Dad's preferred shelving of pressboard and cinder blocks. There were souvenirs from exotic places, a jade sphinx, a brass Hindu god, and a bare-breasted wooden woman holding a cup in her lap. And there was the TV and the cable box, which we eventually turned on. Dad sat in his easy chair, and my wife and I plopped on the floor by his feet to watch a movie called Coffee and Cigarettes, and our daughter called between us. The master bedroom had big windows, which could have brought in a lot of nice light had the blinds not been closed. Against the wall was a tall street-sized garbage container that was maybe 20 years old and half full of aluminum cans of generic Diet Cola and malt liquor. The second bedroom had a low shelf of books. During the move, he'd reduced his collection to one work per author. I wonder how many Vonnegut's he'd had to get rid of to get to the Sirens of Titan, and what it was like to let go of those old hardback copies of Cat's Cradle and Slaughterhouse-Five. He'd done the same with other authors too. I noticed he kept everything I'd given him. My father had long prided himself on traveling light, that he could move himself with his own van in one day, and in this apartment his lightning came to an end. It was my grandmother who called and told me he died. His health had been failing and he'd taken his life. I flew down with my family. I had a second child by then. We arrived at my grandparents' first, that oasis at the end of the cul-de-sac. The current recession had begun, and the homes of new neighbors were already empty and posted for sale. My grandmother peeked through the curtain window next to the front door and called my name. She unlocked the door and screen, and I came in and leaned down to hug her and smelled her familiar shampoo and felt the coarseness of her hair. After I greeted her and my uncle's family, they led me to the dining room table, which was covered with photos of my father. They were removing some for a poster to be displayed at the memorial. There was a photo of my dad looking adventurous as he steered an aluminum skiff across an Alaskan bay, and another of him looking unsure as he held my baby daughter. "We went over to your father's today and cleared out most of his things," my grandmother said. "They're out back." My uncle walked with me through the kitchen and the laundry room into the backyard to the sunroom. The afternoon sun still shone bright off the concrete patio. My uncle said, "We found the will today. He left everything to you." He put his hand on my back warmly. I crossed the cobbled pavers through the verdant grass of the back lawn. I grabbed the handle of the sunroom screen door. It was stuck, so I jostled it open. My new possessions were laid out before me. They were heaped on the buckling ping pong table and formed a pile on the floor surrounded by the aged wicker furniture that had faded from white to gray. The peacoat, the fishing poles, tackle box, toolboxes, pistol, rifles and knives, an enormous flathead screwdriver over a foot long, books in boxes, and small round laundry baskets which the mesh was breaking from, grocery bags full of t-shirts and towels, the old Scrabble board, the chess set, the gaudy lamp of the nude, a cane and the forearm crutches with the circular braces for the triceps and pegs for the hands to grip, the cheap wheelchair he picked up at the Salvation Army after blowing out his hamstring, and there were a couple pairs of the prosthetics legs, sprawled bodiless, the fiberform flesh of the fake calves naked, with the black socks and Oxford still on, the laces tied in hard knots instead of bows, because his socks never needed changing. The end.
Fantastic reading, all of you. Thank you for that. In spirit of the unique and the universal, I wanted to pose a question to the panel, and you can address it particularly or more generally. How do you see the essay as a medium that allows for the exploration of the unique and the universal in a general sense, and do you think about that as a writer of essays, how you focus on the unique, but how you have to like shove out toward the universal, and what's your process along those lines? And anybody can sort of take up the question there.
Well, I think, Brandon, that you addressed the essay kind of generally at the beginning of the panel is a form being something that takes on the unique and then makes it universal in a way. And I think of taking your class on the essay and talking about Montaigne, and that he would write very personally about himself and his body and his life, because he believed that by being an expert on himself, he could be an expert on humanity and shed light on what it is to be a person and to be a human being. And I think that that's generally the way I think of the essay in terms of the unique and universal. And in terms of process, for me, it's mostly thinking about starting with stories always, and then trying to figure out why those stories matter. And I think that if I do my job in really asking that question of myself, that hopefully it's a story that would matter to other people, because it will tell them more about themselves than it would tell them about me or my life.
And your work in particular, and I mean, you're writing about your place and your identity in Wyoming. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody from Baltimore had never been to Wyoming, how do they access your work?
Well, that's a good question. Some of you who are in the program remember Matt Zambito, who graduated last year, and he did not have many of the same interests that I do. He wasn't an outdoors sort of guy at all, and so in workshop he was always good for me to be like, well, but I don't understand why this is fun, or why this matters, or why, like, I know you like it, but I don't understand why you like it. And so I started thinking about, I think that talking about place and landscape for me means a lot, and that writing can be beautiful and interesting, but there has to be another takeaway. And so I think about, in the part of the essay that I read tonight, thinking about stories about our parents and who they were before we came on the scene, in kind of the sense of those origin stories and the sense of identity that we get from our parents, and also this inability to ever really know who they were before we were born, is something that to me seems probably universal.
Sure.
And so even outside of talking about wilderness or country or Wyoming, I think there's that sense of what do we get from our parents and where do we go with that knowledge.
Because obviously anybody from Baltimore would also have their own stories of their own family, of their own Genesis story that comes handed down to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Other responses to this?
I think about, well, as far as the question relates to process, the idea of research comes to mind. And
right.
So when I think of something to write about, there's usually often maybe an instance that occurred or an emotion. Bread, for example, making bread, and my feelings on that. But then there are always more things that I want to know about
right.
it. So I kind of go to books or information in other genres. And so just that process alone I think opens it out from something that's just about me to something that's about other things. And as far as a personal essay, you know, there's something sort of therapeutic in writing about things that happen to you. But there's also something therapeutic in making connections between those things and other things out there in the world. And so you kind of get that step into the more universal.
And research is one way to sort of enlarge it. And I saw and I heard lots of research occurring in all of these different essays today. I didn't know that it was until the 1800s that they knew yeast was a living organism, for example. And we got research about Wyoming and Gerald R. Ford. I have not read his autobiography, but and so that is one way. I always tell my students that the trick of writing a good essay is that you have to be smarter than you are on the page, which is, it's a tall order. And the other thing is, for a reader, I want to come away knowing something I didn't know prior to reading that essay. It can be deeply, deeply personal, but I want to come away knowing something that I didn't know before. Heaven forbid we read an essay and come away dumber than we were before we went into it. Never, that's a bad outcome. So the stakes are incredibly high as far as that goes. Other responses?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the essay as like a manifestation of the scientific method, and I think the last time I had learned the scientific method was like 8th grade. But I know that it begins with a hypothesis or with a question, a research question or whatever question. And in, you know, my first iterations, I was in elementary school or middle school or high school, when your teacher asks you to write a personal narrative, it's like, okay, I'm going to go home and I'm going to write a little story about something that happened in my life. But as I started to take creative writing classes in college and here, I started to think about the essay totally differently, and that it's not about, well, it is about telling a story, but it's not about finding the answer or answering the question that you just went out to search for. It's actually just about documenting the search, or, I mean, kind of wallowing in the complexity of that search and like coming to terms with not ever finding an answer necessarily. I guess like one of the questions that I kind of set out to answer in this on indignation piece was how I came from Grand Rapids and ended up this kind of person that I am, and also trying to understand how grief works. A lot of what I write actually deals with my father's death, and I kind of shy away from writing, like wanting to write about that, because I feel as if it's sort of just using my melodrama of my life and like, okay, this is really interesting to me, but not really interesting to anyone else. And so I think that when you kind of bring in like the Today Show or my mom's obsession with property virgins, or like bringing in like Gerald R. Ford, who was a president that not very many people pay attention to, but he came from Grand Rapids, so I'm interested in him. And then bringing in kind of like news, current event things that are on the TV in the background all the time, I think can open up like a personal exploration and make it accessible for a larger audience.
Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, kind of just to echo what Carl was saying, but a lot of times in memoir, it's not researching things out there so much as researching something about your family, like memorabilia, an old photo, and I mean something about that, even though that item in itself is unique to your story. I mean, there's something really fascinating about that for everybody, and I think there's a lot of drama because we're all obsessed with our families, and so it's that detective story that comes to the page in memoir.
And I would say in the essay as well, to distinguish between the two forms. I think in your piece, Aaron, that image at the end of the prosthetic feet and the socks that he never has to change was so affecting to me as a reader because it was completely unique to your father's experience, but it speaks volumes to anybody who suffered that sort of trauma in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. It reverberates and resonates on so many other levels, so it's absolutely the unique and the universal. Any questions from the audience about these essayists, the writing process, the essay as a form? Anything that you heard that they read that you want to know more about? Any questions from you?
I have a question for Kara. So you said that, you fear that the exigence for your essay may have passed. Obviously it was dealing with events like the Gifford shooting and stuff like that in the spring. So how do you revise that to make it more, I resist the universal thing, I don't know why. Well, but more something that would resonate, like say 20 years from now, like why do we still read the White Album
The White Album.
You're right.
Yeah.
Why do we still read that? Although some of this seem relatively dated as well, but there's something that draws you back to digging. So what would you have to do to it?
Well, I don't know. One answer is to take Gabrielle Gifford out of it, and to make this just a piece that's dealing with the threads of Gerald R. Ford and sexuality and family and kind of what it means to grow up in Grand Rapids. I don't know. I don't know if this essay if I fix it up, if it would be placeable anywhere right now because of its being sort of past, and that event wasn't big enough for people to be able to think about, okay, I remember the Take Back the 20 website, I know what she's talking about. So I don't know, as far as preserving it, I guess you could always, there's plenty of other things that are going on right now, but I don't know how you stick it in a time capsule and hope it survives. I don't know.
Well, I don't know about, I'm wondering, I've read lots of essays that, okay, the White Album is one example, that I think especially in a sort of on-demand televisual culture that we live in, it's up to people like essayists to say, let's not forget about these things. It's so easy in a very now sort of centered world where status updates are instantaneous and we forget about yesterday's posts, that these things are significant and that who else is going to chronicle them? Now, the journalists are out there chronicling these things on a day-to-day basis, but the difference between journalism and an article versus an essay is that the journalist is there to record. But the essayist, I would argue, is there to record and speculate and make conjecture and wonder and sort of slow it down and make it bigger and more salient and say, what does this say in the bigger context? So if it doesn't work because it's too timely, it's probably more to do with the writer not being able to engage the form. And I think Kara's doing interesting things that will make it sustainable. Does that make sense? There's a way in which the art form can rescue it from being dated or stamped. But that's hard. That comes by a lot of hard work to be able to resuscitate the past and make it resonate and relevant to a contemporary and ongoing instance.
Well, and it sounds kind of formulaic, but I think whenever you boil an essay down to the human condition or what it means to be human, it's got more of a chance of being sustainable, I guess. And I don't know if I'm doing that yet, but I think that, I don't know, when you think about an issue like the shooting in Tucson, a reporter would just this is what happened, and then an essayist would be kind of what does that mean about all of us? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of a CNN report I saw several years ago as a child had died in Disney World. And they didn't know what it was, and the anchor is talking to the reporter in the field, and said, wasn't it true that it was earlier this year another child had also died there at Disney World in Florida? And she said, yes, that's true. And the anchor said, well, it's been a tough year for Disney. You know, and I'm like, did she really say that? Not that it's been a tough year for the families who just lost their kids at Disney World? And it was like, okay, back to you, Fred, with the banana report coming in from Chiquita. And that's, you know, and the essayist's job is to say, no, wait a minute. No, pause. Pause and let's go sort of vertical and unpack what that means. And I think it behooves us even more in a kind of live streaming world to say time out, to say pause, that there is more to that. And we sort of get conditioned, I think, to be like, oh, 30 or 3,000 people died yesterday, and then we're on to the next news chunk, you know, that there's a way in which our sensibilities are sort of almost being rerouted in a way, and I sort of resist that. And I think the essay, among other art forms, is one way to sort of maybe slow that down. Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
First, thank you. I want to go home and do this.
That's a good thing.
I don't know if this was there because I was looking for it or wanting it to be there after the first reading, but I noticed that you all kind of hit on a shock value at a point where it's like we're reading or we're listening along, and then it's like, whoa, man, and then it's like, how did you get there? You know, it's like you let us in, and then it's like all of a sudden you're on a different topic from where you started, but it fit, but it was you know, there was a shock value to it. And I was just wondering, you mentioned like a formulaic idea, and it seemed to come in each one at about the 2/3 point. And I was thinking about Johann Sebastian Bach and the golden ratio, and Miles Davis had this, when he would blow on his improvs, he'd get to about the 2/3 point, and then he would throw a lick in that would not detach him just from the audience, but from his other performers. So they didn't know what to do with it, and they kind of took it, and he kind of brought them on this weird journey they weren't expecting, and then kind of brought it back. And I was just wondering, is there something systematic about that? About the point of time, or am I?
Essays in general are just a form where you're allowed like a lot of digression, and it's kind of mimicking stream of consciousness or the journey of the mazy mind. So I mean, like certainly with my piece, I kind of knew where I was going. I was just trying to set things up and sort of give all this background to sort of hit on what was really the key part of the essay for me. And I think the form allows for that kind of play.
I think that's one of the great gifts of the essay, is that the essay that's well written is not only a surprise to the writer, but to the reader. If I know where an essay is going to end before I begin it, why write it? I have no. And I love that you brought up Miles Davis, because I tell my students in workshop that it's not unlike a jazz riff, that there'll be a riff that sort of goes out there, but it does come back. It has to come back to the main somehow. And Aaron used that term, Cynthia Ozik's term, the following one through the mazy mind, that they move associatively, and there's more room for that. I don't know if any of you want to respond more to that.
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting that you notice that at similar points in the essay. I think your explanation is great, and I wish I could come up with it myself. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really interesting, and probably it has a lot to do with that sort of movement, digression, or meditative quality to an essay.
There's just like so many ways to achieve a similar effect, I think, in the essay, that it's so wide open. I don't know.
That you can cover a lot of different terrain, and I always say that, you know, part of the essay's interiority is finding unforeseen connections between otherwise disparate ideas. That you're looking, what can we learn about X by examining Y? You're looking at different things and you put them up against one another and you can make really interesting connections that people wouldn't normally make. Now, to make those kind of connections, you're not going to follow a sort of linear path to get there. It takes a very associative mind that's sort of ready-made to, that has, Tony Early said that he was superstitious of the idea of metaphor, or no, he believed in metaphor to the degree, to the level of superstition. And I think that there's part of the essayist's sensibility is sort of, the nerve endings are out there and open to that idea that you see connections out there. And sometimes the connections don't work. Sometimes it's an overreach. Sometimes you're asking too much and it's overwrought. Sometimes you have to work a little harder to make it clear, to make it resonate not in an overt way, but in an artful way. And that's a different kind of negotiation. So I don't know if that helps answer your question at all. Any other questions?
So I'm thinking about this televisual idea, and kind of this culture that we live in now, where we're all kind of pop stars in our own music videos that are our lives. And in the context of nonfiction writing and essay writing and telling our own stories. And, there's, somebody just asked about the shock value in his essays. It's so critical in, making an essay readable. And I was just wondering what you all thought, because all of these essays are they're so striking and valuable for such different reasons. So I'm just wondering, in the context of this culture that we live in now, whether you think that the essay is kind of capitalizing on everyone's sort of desire to read individual stories and also tell their own, and if in some way the essay is elevating that culture or vice versa, if it's kind of overrated by it. Just how you think the two are kind of influencing each other. Does that make sense?
I think, in terms of just thinking about the shock value, this is maybe tangential, but I don't ever start out to intentionally shock a reader. You want to have tension and dramatic tension, certainly, but there's a certain amount of that that's just deflated in the essay automatically because, especially if you're writing about yourself, or I'm writing about my parents before I was born, so obviously they made it. And we're all here, but you have to get that tension in there somehow. And in terms of the way that the essay might be in conversation with or capitalizing on interest in personal stories, I think the essay actually forces us to think more than a lot of media would. And that as a form, the essay has been around for a really long time. And so what we're doing, what we're doing is new in that we're doing it for the first time, but it's also something that's been happening for a long time, in this desire to tell stories, to think about our lives, to question things and explore things and try and better understand our world. And so I think that that's just a tradition that's part of our attempt to come to terms with who we are and where we are in the world. I don't know if that makes sense.
Other responses?
My essay, I think, has a lot of shock value at the end, but like to echo what Ann was saying, it was kind of the process of setting that up. I had to sort of think about my grandparents' role, and I worked with all these houses and built up that setting. And just the context of what was happening and how my family was all involved in this my dad passing. So, I mean, I think it is, and I don't think all my pieces are as dramatically intense as this piece in particular, but I do think that there's something of the shock value factor that makes it a good piece. I mean, I think it's the dramatic portion really helps, and it brings an immediacy to the need to figure out the other things that help to complete the essay.
Yeah.
Well, a personal essay is way more than a Facebook post or Facebook update, but I think that Facebook and the internet in general maybe modeled its webness on the essay because everything is so interconnected and you can click a link and it's like, okay, that's my tangent, and then you come back to the backbone of the main page. The essay was doing that since forever.
One essayist who's doing that in a very sort of overt sense is Andrew Monson, where he's using hyperlinks and that sort of thing, that he's sort of modeling that very participatory engagement in an essay and showing it in a televisual world. You know, it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, there are a lot of blog posts out there that I think are really remarkable essays, and they're blog posts, and I think there are a lot of them that are really bad. You know, probably a lot more of them are bad than good. But what the web has done has just it's given itself over to people to tell their story. You know, and a lot of people really don't care to have like a literary affect or aspect to it. They just want to tell their story, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. You know, I think that that's a good thing. Why? A, they're writing. B, they're trying to tell their story. C, they're trying to tell it to other people. They're trying to connect. Yes, it's through cyberspace, and I have other, you know, maybe dilemmas with that, but the impulse, I think, is good. I don't think it's a bad thing. I wouldn't say stop writing your blog, you know. Nothing good can come from telling people to stop writing. So, but it's going to be interesting to see how this eventuates, and it's for anybody's guess. It's up to anybody. I have no idea, but there is a definite interplay between the two. Add anything more about it?
I mean, one thing that I was thinking about while listening was going back to that idea of shock value, and I have certainly felt in my life a sense of mild panic, maybe because not many shocking things have happened to me, and I don't know if I want to write then what in the world am I going to write about. Reading, for example, Annie Dillard for the first time really kind of blew my mind because, you know, she's writing about living in a little cabin by herself and going out on walks, and not much shocking going on, but she does a lot of really exciting thinking, and so that made a really big impression on me, that what can be sort of shocking or exciting in a piece of writing is actually where it goes back to that idea of the mazy mind, but where the writer's mind takes you, and those exciting leaps and associations that can happen.
And it can very often entail the mundane, the banal, the quotidian, the perfunctory. The sort of dailiness of life is what we all experience. If you want to talk about something universal, that's it. I mean, Virginia Woolf wrote an essay about a dead moth, you know? And you can imagine her friends, what are you working on? Oh, a piece about a dead moth. Good luck with that. Sounds fascinating. But it turns out that it was extraordinary and it was beautiful, but it didn't concern anything of grand design. When I write essays, I like to consider myself a shock light sort of, you know, a writer. And I think a lot of the best essayists are shock light. is that a term that?
It should be.
Yeah. That it's about the smaller, it's about the things that occur in the periphery, you know, and that's the sort of binding agent of the human experience. It's the small things. Maybe one more question. Huh? Thank you so much, and thanks to our panel. Please give them another.